one thing I want to address, and what Aristotle is obsessed with in this entire text, is the difference between happiness and pleasure in their relationship. And for Aristotle, there's a curious relationship here. In one sense, happiness and pleasure couldn't be more different from one another. Happiness is not pleasure. Pleasure is something passive. It doesn't satisfy you, where happiness is something self-satisfying and it leads to flourishing. On the other hand, happiness does have to do with pleasure, in the sense that happiness is all about learning to like the right kind of pleasures. That is, disciplining yourself with reason and training yourself to like the higher and more noble kind of pleasures. And Aristotle therefore there's a big presupposition here, in that there are different kinds of pleasures. There's a hierarchy of pleasures for Aristotle. So there are base pleasures that have more to do with our animality and our physicality, and there are more lofty pleasures that have to do with our spiritual or rational side. For example, let me just say this before I go into the examples. This may sound crazy to you, that pleasure is pleasure. What some people find pleasurable is not what I find pleasurable. It's different for everybody. It's actually not. We actually recognize this. For example, we can all tell the difference between a Bach cantata, something by Johann Sebastian Bach. I'll put a little link in the description to my favorite Bach cantata. It's called Wachet auf. It's an Advent. It doesn't matter. You can tell the difference between a Bach cantata and, I don't know, a Miley Cyrus song. Now, I'm not knocking Miley Cyrus or whoever happens to be the popular musician of the time, but the reason Bach, I mean, if I really seriously argued with you and said, I think Miley Cyrus is better than Bach, or I think Miley Cyrus is better than Beethoven, you might say, that just doesn't sound right. Bach has staying power. He's lasted a long time, and it's very, very sophisticated. Oh, right there, then we have a difference between lower and higher pleasures. When you try to read, here's another example. When you try to read Shakespeare, right, it's very difficult. You have to discipline yourself. You have to try. You have to take a class. And even then you can finally, after studying it for months and months, you can then open up Shakespeare and have it maybe make some sense to you. On the other hand, if you just try to read like The Hunger Games or Stephanie Meyer's Twilight or whatever is a popular book now, very easily accessible. However, it doesn't have the kind of staying power, and it doesn't have the kind of sophistication to it. And so there's two distinctions here, and there's two important points that distinguishes higher versus lower pleasures. Number one, discipline. The higher pleasures require discipline to feel. They're not easily accessible, okay? And secondly, because they require discipline, they give us more, they have more stability, they last longer, right? They're not as ephemeral or short-lived. They have staying power, and they satisfy you more. So happiness for Aristotle is all about learning to discipline yourself with reason to like the higher pleasures. It's learning to train yourself to like what is actually good for you and what is actually bad. Another example of this is just even cruder examples. I'm not saying Aristotle wants us to be an aristocrat here and learn to like the lofty things and despise the base things, but it has something to do with that. A very simple example is where we find more substance in a longer lasting relationship, like a long-term relationship versus a fling or something that's just engaged in for physical pleasure. Obviously, there's a difference between a romance that's engaged in for simply bodily pleasure versus one that satisfies the needs of your mind and your soul and your spirit and your social well-being and all these things, and your physicality too. Clearly, there's a distinction there. There's more substance. There's more depth to the pleasure. And so Aristotle thinks happiness is training yourself to learn to like the higher pleasures. Take another crude example, really expensive scotch, right? Versus, I don't know, natty ice beer. I mean, you could just pound the natty ice beers, maybe, I don't know, versus something like a really high-end scotch that costs $200. Imagine somebody just guzzling that down. It would almost be blasphemous to do that with a really fine scotch, or even the difference between craft beers versus, I don't know, light beers or something like that. We make these distinctions all the time versus quality pleasure. So there's a hierarchy, clearly. Really good steak versus Burger King. It's all over the place. It's everywhere. The point for Aristotle is happiness is, as an activity in the soul in accordance with reason, is training yourselves to learn to like the right things, the more noble things, the higher pursuits. Philosophy, the humanities, science, thinking, thought. When you put when you put discipline into your thought life and into your social life and into lasting friendships and lasting relationships and knowledge, and when you try, the payoff there is much higher. You can think about this. The joy you get from true friends or from learning something and studying is different than, just going out and having fun with people you don't really care about. There's a difference here. And he's not knocking the lower pleasures for Aristotle. This is the key. He thinks they're necessary. We're rational animals. We're animals. We need physical pleasure. We need to have fun. But if you live a life just for those more base pleasures, you'll not be happy. The human being has deeper and higher needs.